The police officer put a laptop on my kitchen table and turned it around to face me. On the screen was a folder. Inside the folder were files, hundreds of them, organized by date going back almost exactly 2 years. He said, "Do you recognize any of this?" I leaned forward and looked at the thumbnails. My kitchen, my living room, my bedroom window, my backyard, my front porch. My life, cataloged, organized, labeled, by my neighbor. I said, "How long has she been doing this?" He said, "Based on what we've found so far, we think since the week you moved in." I sat back in my chair. I had lived next to this woman for 2 years. I had waved at her across the fence. I had brought her soup when she mentioned she wasn't feeling well. I had trusted her with my spare key in case of emergencies. The spare key. I thought about the spare key. My name is Rachel. I'm 39. I'm a high school English teacher in a mid-sized city in Oregon. And I have spent the better part of the last 3 years trying to understand how I missed something that, in retrospect, had signs everywhere. I moved into my house in June, 2.5 years ago. It was the first home I'd ever owned. A small craftsman bungalow, 3 bedrooms, a yard with an old apple tree that drops fruit every September whether you're ready for it or not. I'd saved for 6 years for the down payment. I was 36 when I moved in, and I remember standing in the empty living room the first day. Just me and the echo of my own footsteps, thinking, "This is mine." My neighbor to the left was a retired couple who kept to themselves and waved from the driveway. My neighbor to the right was Gwendolyn Marsh, 53 at the time. Retired early from some kind of administrative role, she was vague about the specifics whenever I asked. Owned her house outright, she mentioned once, with a particular emphasis that I understood was meant to convey stability and permanence. She'd lived there for 11 years. Gwen was, in those first weeks, the neighbor you hope for. She brought over a plant when I moved in, a succulent, with a note that said, "Welcome to the street." She knew the local rhythms, which trash collection days were which neighbors had dogs that barked at night, the best parking strategy for the street during the farmers market on Saturdays. She was a resource. I leaned on her as a resource. I also, within the first month, found her slightly difficult to read. Not in any way I could articulate, just a quality to her attention that was a fraction too focused. She asked questions that were slightly too specific. Not, "How are you settling in?" but, "What time do you usually get home from work?" And, "Do you have family nearby?" And, "Are you seeing anyone?" Normal questions, maybe, but with a particular quality of data collection underneath them. I noted it. I told myself I was being uncharitable. She was a lonely, retired woman who was curious about her new neighbor. I was a single woman who had moved to a new city and was slightly on guard by default. I let it go. We established a friendly rhythm. Coffee sometimes on Saturday mornings. She'd come over to admire my garden progress. I'd wave across the fence. Normal neighborly contact. She asked for my spare key after about 3 months. She framed it perfectly. Just in case, you never know, a pipe could burst, or you could lock yourself out, or something could happen when you're out of town. All reasonable, all true. I gave it to her. I have thought about that spare key every single day since. The first thing I noticed, and I noticed it and filed it and moved on, the way you do with things that don't yet have a category, was that Gwen sometimes seemed to know things she shouldn't know. Not dramatically, not in a way that raised alarms, just small things. She'd mentioned something about my schedule that I hadn't told her. "Oh, you got home late last night. Was that a school thing?" I would have assumed she'd just seen my lights, except she'd mentioned the time with a precision that was slightly off. I hadn't told her what time I'd gotten home. She'd referenced conversations I'd had. Not with her, with people on my phone, in my own house. Once, after I'd had a long call with my sister about a family situation, Gwen mentioned the topic obliquely the next morning over the fence. Something like, "Family stuff can be so complicated, can't it?" With a look that felt knowing. I told my sister about it. She said, maybe she just overheard something through the window? Maybe. I had a habit of talking on the phone while doing dishes, and the kitchen window was sometimes open. Maybe. The thing is, you can explain away each instance individually. Each one has a plausible, innocent explanation. The pattern only becomes visible when you stop evaluating them separately and look at all of them together. I didn't do that for a long time, because doing that meant concluding something that seemed too dramatic, too paranoid, I kept using this word with myself, crazy. The word crazy is interesting when you look at it later. It's the word you use when you're preemptively dismissing your own instincts to protect yourself from the discomfort of being right. About a year in, I started dating someone. His name was Marcus, and he was the first person I'd been interested in seriously in years. We were careful, early on, getting to know each other, figuring out if this was something. Gwen took a strong interest in Marcus, not in a romantic way, in an investigative way. She'd ask about him constantly. Where did he work? Did I know his family? How did we meet? How long had he been divorced? Questions I'd answered once and then would find asked again a few weeks later, slightly rephrased, as if she were checking my answers for consistency. Once, after Marcus had spent the night for the first time, nothing I'd announced, nothing that was Gwen's business in any way, she said to me the next morning, with a careful smile, "It looks like things are going well with your friend." She'd said friend with a quality that meant she knew exactly what he was. I stood at the fence and said, "Gwen, how do you know he was here?" She said, "Oh, I just assumed from your car being in the driveway." My car is always in my driveway. That's not evidence of anything. I went inside and stood in my kitchen and thought, for the first time with real seriousness, something is wrong. I did something that felt, at the time, both reasonable and slightly humiliating. I started being more careful in my own home. I closed my blinds more. I stopped talking on the phone in the kitchen with the window open. I was more conscious of my routines, my comings and goings, the ordinary sounds of a life that I was now trying to conduct more quietly. And I started noticing the camera. It was in a birdhouse. I want you to understand that I'm saying this, and it still sounds absurd to me. A birdhouse, mounted on the fence post at the corner of Gwen's yard that faced my side yard and rear yard. I had walked past that birdhouse approximately 400 times. I had thought nothing of it because it was a birdhouse, on a fence, in Oregon, where people have birdhouses on fences. What I noticed, one afternoon in late autumn, when the leaves were down and the light was different, was that the hole in the birdhouse was slightly too large and slightly too regular, and that there was no bird activity. There had never been any bird activity, now that I thought about it, in 2 years of that birdhouse existing. I took a photograph of it from my yard with my phone. Then I went inside and Googled disguised outdoor cameras. The birdhouse came up on the 4th result. I sat with that for a long time. I went back and forth. I was either uncovering something genuinely disturbing, or I was a woman who had gotten too deep in her own head and was about to accuse her neighbor of something based on a birdhouse and a coincidence about knowing what time she'd gotten home. I called my friend Dana, who was a paralegal, and described everything without mentioning what I suspected. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Rachel, I think you should call the non-emergency police line." "You think I'm not being crazy?" "I think you're describing a pattern," she said, "and patterns are data." I filed a report. A detective came to my house. I showed him the birdhouse. He took a careful look and said he couldn't confirm anything from visual inspection, but that if I had probable cause concerns, he could look into it. What happened next moved faster than I expected. The detective, doing a routine follow-up, found that Gwen had a prior complaint in another county. A neighbor had accused her of surveillance activity years ago. The complaint had been dropped, but it was on record. Combined with the birdhouse and the pattern I'd documented, it was enough for a warrant. When they searched her house, they found not one camera, they found 7. I'm going to tell you what they found, and I want you to sit with it the way I sat with it. The birdhouse camera in the side yard. A small camera mounted inside a decorative rock near my back fence, angled toward my rear windows. A camera in a fake electrical outlet cover on the exterior of her house, facing my front porch. And here is where it moves from disturbing to something I don't have an adequate word for. 3 small cameras that had been placed inside my house. Inside my house. In the outlets. In objects that I hadn't noticed had been changed. The spare key. She had used the spare key to enter my home and place cameras at some point in the first year. The detective told me this as carefully as he could, and I listened, and then sat very still for a long time. She had been in my home. She had placed cameras in my home. She had recorded 2 years of my life, my kitchen, my living room, my conversations, my relationships, my private moments, and stored them in organized files on a laptop in her home office. Why? That was the question I asked the detective. Why would someone do this? He'd dealt with similar cases before, he said. Not frequently, but occasionally. Sometimes it was about control. Sometimes about loneliness that had curdled into something else. Sometimes about the particular satisfaction that comes from knowing things about people that they don't know you know. Was she doing anything with the footage? I asked. He paused. That's what we're still determining, he said. What they determined over the following weeks was this. Gwen had an online presence I hadn't known about. Not social media in the traditional sense, a private forum, membership-based, where people shared what the detective diplomatically called observation content. People's private lives, recorded without their knowledge. An audience that paid for access. My life had been content. My routines, my relationships, my conversations, my grief, because I had cried in my kitchen many times over those 2 years, and apparently that had been watched, had been content for an audience I never knew existed. I sat in the detective's office and stared at a point on the wall behind his head for what felt like a long time. Then I said, "What happens to her?" Gwen was charged with criminal surveillance, invasion of privacy, and multiple counts related to the distribution of the footage on the forum. The forum itself was subsequently investigated and shut down. It turned out my situation was not unique, and the case became part of a larger federal investigation I'm not allowed to discuss in detail. She was convicted on all counts. Sentenced to 4 years with additional civil liability. She lost her house, the legal fees, the civil judgment, the costs, the house she'd owned outright, the permanence she'd mentioned with that particular emphasis in the early days. Gone. I was asked, at various points in the legal process, whether I wanted to make a victim impact statement. I said yes. I wrote it myself, and I read it in the courtroom. And I want to tell you that Gwen looked at me the entire time, and I looked back. I said, "For 2 years I lived in a home that I believed was mine. I made choices in that space, private choices, ordinary choices, the small, intimate choices that make up a life, believing they were witnessed only by me. You decided that my privacy was less important than your curiosity, that my life was a resource you could use. I want you to know that the damage isn't only practical. The damage is to the feeling of safety in my own home. That feeling takes a long time to come back, and it never comes back exactly the way it was." I said some other things too, but that's the part I remember most clearly. The satisfaction, and I'll be honest, there was satisfaction, wasn't about the conviction or the sentence. It was about standing in that room and saying clearly and on the record what had been done to me and what it cost. That naming of the thing, that refusal to absorb it quietly. The community found out, as communities do. The street knew. The neighbors who had waved at Gwen for 11 years, who had accepted her as a fixture of the block, knew. She had cultivated a particular image, careful, stable, a good neighbor, and it had collapsed entirely. The permanence she'd been so proud of had been built on something that couldn't hold weight. I still live in the house. People ask me that, whether I moved, and the answer is no. That house is mine. I saved for it for 6 years. I planted things in that yard and watched them grow. I stood in the empty living room on the first day and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I wasn't going to let Gwen take that from me, too. I had the house swept by a security professional. I installed my own cameras, facing outward, facing my own property, everything legal and documented. I changed the locks. I am careful about who has my spare key now. The birdhouse is gone, obviously. The apple tree dropped its fruit last September, same as always. I made a pie. That sounds mundane, and it is, and that's exactly the point. Marcus and I are still together. We moved slowly for a while after everything. There was a period where I felt exposed in a way that was hard to explain, where intimacy felt complicated by the knowledge that intimacy had been watched. He was patient with that, remarkably patient. He understood, or tried to understand, that the healing wasn't linear. We're good now. Better than good. I think about Gwen sometimes. Less than I used to, more than I'd like. I've tried to understand what drove her to it. The loneliness, the need to be inside other people's lives because her own felt insufficient. The particular corruption that comes from watching without being seen. I understand it academically. I don't forgive it. Forgiveness, in this case, is not something I feel obligated to, and I've stopped performing the gesture for the sake of appearing healed. What I have instead is this: my life, my house, my morning coffee in my kitchen with the window open because I'll be damned if I'm going to keep my windows closed forever. My life witnessed only by the people I choose. That's not nothing. That's everything, actually. Before you close this video, I want to ask you something. Gwen didn't steal from me in any traditional sense. She didn't break anything I could see. She sat on the other side of a fence and smiled and brought a plant and asked about my schedule. And all the while she was turning my ordinary life into something she could use. The thing she stole was assumption. The assumption that my private moments were private, that my kitchen was just my kitchen, that the ordinary texture of my days belonged to me. We live in a time when surveillance is everywhere, when we're watched by cameras and algorithms and platforms we've agreed to without reading the terms. Most of us have made a kind of peace with that. But there's a difference between the surveillance you've consented to and the surveillance you haven't. There's a difference between living in the world and being turned into content without your knowledge. Pay attention to what feels off. Trust the pattern, not just the individual instance. Your instincts are not paranoia, and your private life is yours. Protect it like it matters, because it does.